Oh, look, it's Gale, the Wizard of Waterdeep. Ugh, let me guess, you need another magical artifact?
My condition lets me ignore as little as I do.
Okay, I get it. Back up, dude. This is the third item I've had to steal from the Emerald Grove in order to give in to your little fix. Kind of wishing I played as the Dark Urge right about now. Alright, so remind me, why do I even have this guy in my camp to begin with? He's constantly gobbling up my cool items, and his jokes aren't even that funny. Oh, yeah, that's right, because his story is unlike anything I've ever experienced before in an RPG. Welcome to Figuring Out Fantasy, where we'll be digging into the companion questline of Gale Dekarios, a character who I, and maybe some of you as well, initially shrugged off as being just too high maintenance to truly appreciate. But I think it's that frustration with the complex he puts on the player which ultimately allows for his quest to shine through where it matters most. Be sure to hit the like button if you end up enjoying your stay, and don't forget to comment how you feel about Gale as a companion in Baldur's Gate 3 below. Did he piss you off, or was his charm too tough to resist? I'd love to hear. Oh, and I do need to throw in a little spoiler warning just to be safe, since we are digging into the entirety of the Wizard's questline. Now let's get into it. Okay, so the evolution of coming around to Gale in Baldur's Gate 3 is realistically broken up into 3 phases. Putting up with him, understanding him, and finally fighting for him. And they just so happen to split themselves across the act so well, to the point where it ends up scaling in intensity similar to the events of the plot of the Absolute itself. First, he's just a creepy hand reaching through the fast travel sigil next to the Nautiloid wreck, but by the end, his fate ends up flooding your eyes with tears no matter how it plays out. But how did we get to that point? How does a companion with such tedious maintenance and so much sarcasm that it teeters on the edge of annoying end up being some's favorite character when all is said and done? Well, that's just the power of Gale Dekarios. So let's start from where the relationship is most shaky, the time following when we pull him from the sigil. It's quite interesting. Gale, more than any of the companions we'll recruit during our time on the Ravaged Beach, seems to keep a level head when discussing the most threatening element of our brief adventure, the Mind Flayer Tadpole. But this confident nature is tested not long after we meet the guy, where he starts keeling over in pain and obviously demanding our attention. Turns out this sucker is hungry, but not just for our camp supplies. Gale's hunger here is arcane in nature, and he inconveniently requires magical items to satiate it. And even if we acquiesce by handing over one of our hard-earned pieces of armor, he doesn't mention a peep about what this is all for, making us feel like we would have rather just sold these stupid gauntlets to a trader in the Emerald Grove. But perhaps his handsome charm is enough to keep us from getting annoyed, and we can carry on alongside him knowing that he's just a little junkie itching for that magical juice. Though you don't think that they'd write a character knowing full well that they're just going to be perceived as a nuisance over time, but they did, and that element is exactly what makes the complications of his involvement so incredible to experience. Because Gale realistically isn't annoying, he's desperate. Desperate to save himself from a terrible and tragic fate. Hailing from the bustling city of Waterdeep, a man such as Gale was always driven by one thing: ambition. Even from a young age though, he showed signs of being a wizarding prodigy by not only controlling the weave, but composing it as well. This magical prowess earned him the attention of the mother of magic herself, Mystra, who over time turned from his teacher to his muse, and finally his lover. Yet the ambition within Gale that I mentioned would end up being his undoing when it came to his romance with Mystra. Every user of arcane magic is limited in their capacity of manipulating the weave to whatever degree the Lady of Mystery sees fit. And so every time Gale was with her, he was standing on the precipice, as he phrases it, gazing into the wonders that lay beyond the boundaries set by his lover, which made him want to cross those boundaries. But the Mother of Magic halted him at every request and kept him strung along like a puppy, leading Gale to seek alternative ways to gain her favor in a manner so great that she would allow him to experience something beyond the weave, which would eventually land him in possession of a tomb containing what is assumed to be the lost piece of Mystra's essence that went missing in the attempted rebellion by Carus during his folly. When Gale brought the book back to his library to investigate its secrets a bit deeper, what he found inside was a magical orb that immediately plunged itself inside his chest, afflicting him with the curse that we know him to possess now. It brings up the interesting question of, can a mere mortal like Gale realistically love a goddess? Did Mystra truly love Gale, or did she love the way he worshipped her? And on the other side of the same coin, did Gale truly love Mystra, or did he love the idea of becoming her equal and maybe even more? It's an incredibly thought-provoking setup that we'll only see more development towards as we progress through his questline, and it won't take long, since if you took the trek through the mountain pass, we'll come across arguably the next up in line when it comes to the most important individuals in Gale's questline, Elminster. So with my limited D&D knowledge, Elminster was actually one of the few characters I had heard about before playing this game, and with how Gale calls him the most powerful wizard in the realms, it makes me feel a little silly to have written this guy off as a Gandalf wannabe. Turns out he's probably even stronger, and he's got a pretty bangin' magic card too. Where the fuck was I? Oh, yeah, supposedly the strongest wizard in the realms is approaching us wanting food? That's not very strongest wizard in the realms of you, but I guess. And so yeah, he'll head to camp and stuff his face full, which gave me a heart attack at first, thinking my camp supplies I had left for one more long rest was gone. But luckily not, and instead he'll end up having us at the edge of our seat and revealing a terrible fate for the one who we just started to develop a true bond with. So far in the story, Gale has sounded pretty neutral when it comes to his affliction, not only with the tadpole, but with the orb in his chest as well. In fact, he really only mentioned suggestions towards curing the condition we all face, let alone the hunger that should have only been more and more of a priority as it quickly became harder to satiate throughout Act 1. Luckily, he's here to deliver the first glimmer of agency for Gale to take a hold of, considering his unique dilemma, but it stretches to even greater heights than anybody but maybe Gale could hope to understand, potentially to his detriment. Remember all of the wizard's discussions about Mystra? And how his life's purpose from a young age was to seek her ultimate approval and to glimpse into the realms beyond mortal understanding? Well, the opportunity he's been looking for is being offered to him here and now. Elminster tells of a message from the goddess of magic that would allow Gale to not only be rid of the plague inside his chest, but to also finally be redeemed in the eyes of his former mentor turned lover. But how would this redemption be achieved? Through blowing himself up to destroy the source of the absolute. Excuse me? Just when I'm starting to really come around to this guy, you throw this at me? What makes it even worse is that this information being presented to Gale seems to have put a lock on his mind that we'll need to pick at. It quickly becomes clear that he's convinced himself that the first solution to his conflict given to him is the only possibility. Hell, you can't really blame him for latching onto the idea either, because he's seen no light at the end of his tunnel for quite some time at this point, and has probably been going through the grueling motions of coming to terms that he not only might have to live with this affliction for the rest of his days, but even worse in his eyes, he might have to live out his life without ever having been redeemed according to Mystra. So it's going to take some real digging to try and move him past the stubborn sacrifice of his honor and convince him to find another way. Now, being entirely honest, there isn't much to experience with Gale during Act 2 until the very end. But if you had taken a bit more of a liking to Gale than any of your other camp members, perhaps you engaged in a bit of romance. In which case, Act 2 is chock to the brim with dialogues and moments that give such an amazing insight into the mind of a wizarding prodigy like Gale, especially being under the dire circumstances he finds himself in. Upon entering the Shadow Curse itself, Gale makes it abundantly clear just how dangerous the magic in these lands truly is. He explains how while Mystra holds control over nearly all forms of magic, there are a few that slip through the cracks. Shadow magic, for example, passes through the restrictions of the weave orchestrated by the Lady of Mysteries by the very manner which it is manifested. Its true source is not the weave, but Shar. And while Mystra seems to be a greater figure than Shar in the standings of the gods, not even she can prevent its use by those willing to accept the degradation that comes with the power they wield. So Gale ultimately uses this concern as another justification for why he feels like he must follow through with Mystra's wishes, saying how no matter how annoyed she's been with him up to this point concerning everything that's occurred, she wouldn't propose this request unless there was no other choice, right? All of these comments he's continuing to make really solidify his delusion at this moment in the story. Like I said before, this is also the first moment where there's been a road he feels like he needs to take. He says himself how he feels freer than before, even with the ginormous weight that's now being placed on his shoulders, because he acknowledges that the magical artifacts were only going to continue to be more and more useless as time went on. And now the man who thought his legendary rise to being a prodigal sorcerer would end in nothing but being consumed by either the Mind Flayer tadpole in his brain or the arcane orb in his chest, feels like his life might actually be able to end with purpose. Now, this is some big talk, even for the most generic fantasy characters, especially in the context of the Forgotten Realms where things aren't quite so shonen anime, let me sacrifice myself to save the world for any reason I can find type beat. And the veil of characters having no shivering bone in their body when undertaking these monstrous tasks is clearly stripped away, and vulnerability is even brought to the forefront a lot of the time. So I don't quite buy the fact that Gale is fueled so much by his pride and pursuit of redemption in Mystra's eyes that he wouldn't be showing any sort of emotion other than excitement towards the events that are supposedly to come. Though if you were lucky enough to gain the favor of the Wizard of Waterdeep, he might invite you to a private chat in a plane of existence that's a bit more optimistic than this, where in a moment a bit more conditioned for vulnerability, Gale reveals that he truly is terrified. I mean, he really thinks that this could be the last night he's alive. And with how much we know there still is to go in Act 2, that's just simply not the case. But in his mind, he has no clue when will run up on the Elder Brain, making his circumstances eat away at his psyche non-stop. Though reflecting on the terrors that are in store for Gale isn't all there is to this scene, as he swiftly conjures up a rendition of his personal library and guides us through a bit of reminiscing on what he would spend his time doing back in Waterdeep. And this moment stood out to me as it really put into perspective just what circumstances each and every individual in our party face. Nearly all of them come across as entirely capable of traveling the Sword Coast alone, giving us confidence in trusting them all the way through the end. But that doesn't mean that they're not without their moments of vulnerability, where something like fond memories that they've been forced to leave behind in favor of these troubling times are the only thing that gives them a reason to fight on and attempt to cure this affliction. For Gale specifically, in his current mindset, there's likely a stifled sentiment of regret in the back of his mind concerning the fact that he'll never be able to read the contents of his library ever again. And the more this sequence plays out, the more Gale wishes to have a bit longer with us before his big moment, which in turn likely makes his growing desire to show us a not-so-projected version of this room and gorgeous view feel even more bittersweet, beyond his own selfish wish to sit at his favorite bench and waste an entire day reading. Just a moment ago, it seemed like there was nothing to sway Gale from his mission to be redeemed in the eyes of Mystra, but now the future he'll be leaving to fizzle has moved him in a way that has him showing even just a bit of hesitation. He wants more time, but realistically, he wants to live, and find a way to have all the time he'd ever want. We're cracking through, but we aren't there quite yet, and we'll have to hope that the bond that'll instill itself even further with the wizard from Waterdeep as we progress through the rest of the hurdles in Act 2 allows us to encourage him to find another way. So once we take the lift down towards the core of the Mind Flayer colony, the anticipation of whether or not Gale has seen the light has us at the edge of our seat, but hopefully our interactions with him so far has softened his shell in order to get through. He'll start off visibly full of adrenaline. The moment he's been thinking about non-stop since we spoke with Elminster is here, and it seems like the invasive thoughts of the mission have made him act on instinct as a devout composer of the Weave. So we'll need to talk him out of it here and now, as we were likely worried about, but the strength of our relationship will shine through in a heartfelt dialogue option which will put him at ease, focusing on finding another way through this encounter and subsequently an alternative solution to his problem. Though once we take down Ketheric for good, in the following moments Gale will find himself facing a sudden realization. The crown controlling the brain is the crown of Carus, originally created by the one who infamously attempted to overthrow Mystra and take control of the Weave, which we know by this point plunged magic into a dark period of time. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Such powerful concentration of Netherese magic flowing through the crown was something Gale never expected. And while it's clear that the crown is about as big of a threat as it could be given that it's sitting atop the Elder Brain, the Wizard of Waterdeep is essentially the only member of our camp who knows just what kind of artifact it is. And hinting at a potential alternative way out of this mess, he encourages us to visit Sorceress Sundries once we arrive in Baldur's Gate to read all we can about the circumstances, which may up front sound like some frivolous book shopping, but in reality, it'll end up being one of the most conflicting moments thrust upon our party in the entire game. But it won't be as straightforward as simply checking these books out, or even buying them for that matter. This pursuit of knowledge will lead us to infiltrate the most off-limits sectors of Sorceress Sundries, and it's as dangerous as it is magical. Traps fester this maze, and the solution is not for the faint of heart either. But once we find the lever opening the door named Carus back in the first room, it'll lead us to the most incredible discovery so far. The Annals of Carus is arguably the most important book in Baldur's Gate 3, right up there with the Legend of Ansur and the Necromancy of Thay. But we aren't as interested in its contents as the wizard we've brought with us is, and he'll tunnel vision extremely hard on getting us to hand it over to him so he can explore its contents. It's a tough choice to keep it away from him, simply because of what it could reveal in terms of alternative ways out of Mystra's request. But once he gives it even just a brief read, we're presented with the fact that this very piece of literature explains in detail everything there is to know about the crown, from its construction to its application. And oh boy, does this open a can of worms. Gale immediately begins to act even more emphatic than when he was requesting the book to begin with, now desperately trying to frame a scenario where he ends up with the crown in his possession after destroying and subsequently rebuilding it. Remember that story he told us about Carsus's folly? It seemed at the time like he was presenting it from the perspective of Mystra in the sake of the Weave. But now he's going so far as to say that it wasn't the magic itself which Carus utilized that was to blame, it was the user. Purely to give us the impression that he himself could take control of the Netherese magic that's just oozing from the artifact made by a man who couldn't. And honestly, at this point in time, there's realistically little incentive I've gleaned so far to blindly go along with this request. I mean, sure, we've heard all about how there wasn't a form of magic that Gale couldn't master, but this isn't the Weave, it's Netherese magic, and either way, there's still one big issue. Gale is mortal. This book was obviously written before Carsus's attempt at immortality, but aren't the subsequent consequences enough to give him at least a sense of trepidation when approaching this opportunity here? Either way, this is a moment where two clear paths present themselves, but they're even further elaborated on in the following sequences as we emerge from the storage rooms of Sorceress Sundries. The great Elminster will be awaiting our exit, seemingly aware of the information we gleaned while inside. Yeah, don't worry, I raided your vault too, buddy, and you've got some explaining to do on behalf of Mystra, since we know she's not gonna show her stupid immortal face. Say, what, Mr. Grand Wizard? She actually does want to talk? Oh, but she's not going to apologize for forcing Gale to blow himself up when there's more to the story than she let on? Nice. Sounds just about right for the gods. While we might be bitter towards Mystra at this point, Gale seems to want to at least entertain what she has to say. I guess he respects the simple aspect of being able to speak with her after all the time that's passed since they last spoke. And if we bring him along to the Stormshore Tabernacle per Mystra's request, he'll make it a point that he goes about this alone, even though he knows how much we've become tied into this alongside him by this point. I mean, Mystra isn't even allowing us in to begin with, but I think it's better this way. As much as I wanted my character to witness the discussion between these two ex-lovers, this conversation has been a long time coming. There's still so much Gale wishes to tell and learn from Mystra concerning the events of the past year or so. But unfortunately, it seems that this discussion in store for Gale will only be about the most pressing matters at hand. The information Gale thinks he knows, and furthermore, the information Gale needs to know but doesn't quite understand. Though little does she know, what she's about to reveal will only bolster the desire that Gale has to rebuild the crown. It just so happens that the orb that had plagued Gale in Act 1 and prior as a result of seeking the approval of Mystra is one born of the Karsite Weave. No, actually, it's half the entire Karsite Weave. An orb that hungers for power just as Karsus did, and it can never be sated. And she makes sure to point out that this is realistically all sourced from Gale's selfish choices aimed at preserving his self-image in the eyes of a god he didn't truly understand. As without his actions, the orb would have never been released from the tome that it was kept in, and Mystra wouldn't be forced to let it feed on the true weave for as long as the Absolute is still a threat. But Gale is able to piece together even further what this statement from Mystra means, and interprets it in a way that doesn't instill more fear like she may have hoped for, but only brings out his ambition that defines his character. If the orb inside his chest is one half of the Karsite Weave, and the crown atop the brain is the other half, there could be potential for the two in tandem to allow Gale to transcend and command power as a god himself if he can get his hands on the latter, which in his mind could be interpreted as destiny. She's given him a lot to think about nonetheless, and once he comes back to the material plane, the rest of his questline is presented as an almost perfect feeling dilemma in terms of writing. All this time, we were hesitant to understand the intentions from the perspective of Mystra, being that it always felt like there was an element of Gale being taken advantage of. But now that he's found a workaround in his potential to rebuild the crown and become a god through the orb in his chest, it's presented as the agency we've wanted him to have this whole time. Though similar to his newfound agency that was presented to him by Elminster in Act 1, we could now be blinded by what feels like the perfect opportunity to get out of this matter with the goddess of magic. Mystra's sentiment being heard honestly gives us pause knowing now that it could be for the best sake of the weave if competing magical gods were kept out of the equation as much as possible, especially ones who have known a life of mortality for the most part like Gale. Or it could feel like the risk is worth it to take, even with the potential consequences, knowing that we've seen a bit of an unfair side to how the gods operate, since a character like Gale is an example of somebody who might not simply crumble to the might of the immortal beings above, which could realistically allow him to carve his own path of ambition, where he would promote ideals of that said ambition to those who are daring enough to take their fate into their own hands. All of these factors contribute to what plays out in the finishing sequences with the Elder Brain and the Absolute, and they manifest in one of three endings, my favorite of which I bet you wouldn't expect. The first two are the opposite halves of the opportunities presented to us once Gale meets with Mystra. Once the brain is defeated, he either rebuilds and hands the crown to Mystra and relinquishes the pursuit of godhood for the betterment of the weave, becoming a professor of illusion in Waterdeep, or he takes a hold of the opportunity with a vice grip once he obtains the rebuilt crown, ignoring Mystra's wishes and becoming the god of ambition. And to be honest, there are sacrifices made on both sides that leaves the moment at the reunion feeling slightly bittersweet, as Professor Gale has the benefit of our beloved wizard being able to live out the rest of his mortal life the way he always knew to be the case. But the element of him being potentially chosen by the Karsite Weave when the orb was thrusted into him is left to the wayside, and could feel like a missed opportunity when all is said and done. Though at the same time, God of Ambition Gale seems to be the ending he's most satisfied with. I mean, of course, he's a literal god. But while this might be the ending he's most satisfied with, there's no denying that he's on another level now. And to be honest, he once spoke of how he would do anything just to spend another day with us back when he wasn't sure when his last moments would be. Yet now he's entirely willing to take his place outside of our reach in godhood. Yeah, I get it, being a god isn't easy, but he had to have known it would end up like this. Unless we ascended ourselves alongside him, where, to be honest, there doesn't seem to be any negatives as long as we fit Gale's needs instead of the other way around. I guess the answer to the question then is no, a mortal can't truly love a god. Godhood will always be too enticing for mortals for the immortality to not have them operate in an entirely different fashion going forward. Gale went from being all about us to maybe still all about us, but only under his conditions. Maybe Professor Gale is the right option, even though it feels like there was something great left on the table. The third and last scenario is definitely not the right option though, as I'd take either of the first two I just spoke about before this one. But there is one part about it that I'll admit brought me to tears the first time I experienced it. In the Professor Gale ending, where he relinquishes the crown, he tells us that it feels like he was able to exhale for the first time after holding his breath for so very long. It really puts into words just what the weight of that damned orb was like to carry around for our journey up to this point. So if you happen to take the course with Gale, in which the discussion at the stem of the Elder Brain is the send-off for the great arcane explosion he was sent by Mystra to do, by either refusing to read the annals of Carus or not visiting with Mystra at the Stormshore Tabernacle, it reveals everything about Gale that I may have either taken for granted or just truly didn't understand over the course of our adventure. Watching him hype himself up with a shaky breath as he sets his sight on the top of the Elder Brain really lets the moment settle in as to just what kind of weight this man is carrying up this climb. His primary concern above all else though is that we're spirited away to safety before anything happens. He says himself that he wishes he was a more selfish man. Once at the docks, the whole party sees the great explosion in the distance and recognizes the victory over the Absolute, but can't help feeling uneasy at the prospect of no longer having the bubbly wizard by our side in the future. And the hardest experience to swallow concerning that is at the camp celebration, where this time around, there is merely a spectral voice of Gale with his final words set to play back to us without the ability for response. The purpose of this projection is to deliver a letter with his final sentiments and feelings, the contents of which can be a variety of alterations, but most can be summed up by his response to our pointless attempt at one last hug.
How fortunate I was to know someone like you.
He really was our biggest fan. Well, while I go get rid of the tears that are welling in my eyes, why don't you all head down to the comments section to let me know your final thoughts on Gale Dekarios. He's really become one of my favorites in the process of making this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh, and make sure to keep figuring out fantasy. Can't forget that one.